I was approached by a group of people who were wanting to bid to conduct the 1983 British election study. There's a group of people within Oxford, headed by Anthony Heath. Um, and to cut then a very long story short, because there was an awful lot of academic machination along the way, um, our bid was eventually successful. And by that stage, we had also teamed up with the National Centre for Social Research, as it is now known. It was then Social Community Planning Research, headed by the late Sir Roger Jowl. And that therefore meant I was getting into the world of designing surveys and designing questions to do that, as well as also at the other end of the process, analysing the data that's produced. So shall I say that questionnaire design meetings between Roger Jowl, Anthony Heath, and myself could be pretty heated affairs. Not that we were, they were intellectually heated. We weren't losing our temper with each other.
So was this very often very pleasant arguments? Were they often
Yes.
arguments about very fine details in the questions? Could it
Yes,
be a
but
word or a phrase?
sure. Well, it's through that then, as it were, my skills about what makes good questionnaire design was in a sense was learnt on the trade. And the truth is that Roger Jowl was particularly acute and effective at this. And crucial point number one is that almost undoubtedly the way in which you ask a question about a subject is certainly at risk of influencing the outcome. So you do have to be very careful about thinking about, well, what's the most balanced way of doing something. Or alternatively, you might sometimes deliberately frame a subject in one direction and then in another direction and see what difference it makes. And certainly in general, particularly on British social attitudes, where we like to be able to investigate a subject using a lot of questions, coming at a subject from more than one angle, again, to try and make sure that you're not just relying on the wording of a particular question. I mean, very often, both as academics, and this is often true of journalism, you want to know, why did somebody do something? All right. The temptation is to say, well, why did you vote Labour, or why did you vote Conservative? And the truth is, for the most part, you learn not to do that, because, I mean, in a sense, it's the old story about what's the best way of understanding why the chicken crossed the road where it did. Is it a good idea to ask the chicken, or is it a good idea to look at the layout of the road and the amount of traffic and what other attractions there might have been on the other side of the road where? In other words, what are the possible reasons as to why the chicken might have decided to cross the road where it did? You need to, understand the motivations of the chicken, the circumstances in which it's operating, etc., etc. And that, of course, very often with voting behaviour, and indeed more broadly, there are often alternative theories out there about why people might be doing something. In other words, you ask people about the various things that might influence their attitudes towards this issue, and then you rely on statistical analysis to work out which of these are the things that most matter. So the first thing, also in doing that, of course, very often in academic life, we sometimes have quite complex theories. No good referring to those. And so that therefore means being able to translate from conceptual theory into everyday language, which then takes me to my crucial point, which is you just have to remember that the average reading age of the adult population is about 11 or 12, and that wherever possible, you need to be using as simple language as possible.
But I presume what you're not after is yes/no answers. I mean, you do want something by way of an
No,
argument.
particularly the truth is, particularly academics don't want yes/no answers, and that's not just perversity. I mean, sometimes you do. I mean, you do want to know whether or not people voted or not. Okay, so you're trying to analyze turnout. So sometimes, insofar as you're interested in explaining behavior, then you might want a yes/no response. But very often, I mean, again, in the end, what one identifies with, so even if you're trying to explain why somebody, yes or no, it's always going to be a probabilistic answer. So if somebody has a very strong sense of emotional attachment to a political party, they may well be more likely to turn out to vote than if they don't. In terms of using statistical models, we quite like to be able to ask people questions whereby we can go, you know what, this is a count from 1 to 10. So we can say, okay, right, I've got this lovely measure from 1 to 10 about what I think about the health service. So I can then take that lovely measure from 1 to 10 and run it in a statistical procedure against, whether or not you're in favor of paying, of spending more money on the health service. And I've got something that's really potentially more powerful than simply a yes/no response to a question.
Yeah. Okay. Well, to the nitty gritty, the question of
Yeah.
selecting people to ask questions to,
Oh, right.
that's what we do in our oral history projects. We want to be representative, if at all possible, across the spectrum of a particular subject. People will want to know, how are these individuals selected to be asked the questions that you're talking about, Sir John?
Well, if you're talking about academic survey research, and certainly something like British sociology, the answer to you, it might sound perverse, is at random. We don't have a population register, anybody has access to, although obviously the National Health Register is pretty close to one. But what we do have is we have the postcode address file. And the postcode address file is a pretty comprehensive record. It's very close to 100% of all the addresses in the UK. Now, unfortunately, it contains business addresses rather than residential addresses, and what one's after is the residential population usually. But with that caveat, basically all residential addresses are there. So you therefore can use a selection procedure, again, we can get into some finer detail, that basically says to a computer, pick X addresses at random. Right, and computers have random number generators, or you can simply list them by some addresses by some criterion rather than just pick the nth address or whatever, depending on what you want. But it's essentially that process at random. But the point is, because all the addresses are in there, everybody has a chance of being selected. And if it's done purely at random, everybody has the same chance. Now, of course, you then got the issue of what do you do within households. These days, because things are now being increasingly done online, you basically have to say to people, well, look, here are a couple of logins, and we want you to, two of you in the household, to do it. And there you don't have as much control. Historically, when you were doing face-to-face interviewing, the interviewer's computer would literally say to them, right, make a list of all the adults in the house. And then the computer will tell you which one person in that household we want you to select. And that, again, is purely at random. Now, the truth is, not even all academic research is done in this way. And certainly most opinion polling, well, there is a bit of it that's done through a process of random sampling. But most of it is done through panels of people who are recruited by advertising, etc., and they're invited to join a panel of people who are willing to answer questions, perhaps for some monetary compensation. But then what you're then doing is that if somebody joins a panel, you ask them lots of questions about themselves, including maybe how they voted last time. And you're then basically selecting people from that panel by their demographic characteristics and more or less in proportion. So, if you're trying to get the right balance of men and women, then you'll be selecting 52% of women and 48% of men, or whatever it is. And you're relying on that demographic representativeness to trust that the sample of people you've got are represented the general public. Now, much argument, much debate. I mean, the academic literature does say that basically it doesn't really matter whether you do a survey face-to-face, telephone, or online. What really does seem to matter to the quality of a sample is whether it's randomly selected or not.
Interesting. But you use the terminology panel. That's
Yes.
people in an individual location. That's just describing a group of
No,
people.
no, no. It's a group of
Well,
people who, by a panel, we mean a body of people who have agreed to do interviews online or maybe on some occasions over the phone, right? So these are people who have been pre-recruited to any individual survey. And they're kind of, I mean, the way I've described it for the opinion pollsters is literally through advertising and trying to get people to join.
if it is a phone interview,
Yes.
the training of the person actually putting the questions. I mean, that surely is crucial here.
Oh, yes. Oh, sure. Well, both face-to-face and telephone. Um, basically speaking, interviewers learn to be A, inscrutable, and
Meaning
B,
what? Meaning what?
meaning if somebody says, yes, I believe in the death penalty, you don't say, you certainly don't say, oh, surely not, but you poker faced. You say, okay, fine, thank you very much. You move on to the next question. So you in no sense give a sense of what your view might be. Okay. Impartial is perhaps another word you might use, but I think it's inscrutable. It's that you are poker faced. You you're not poker faced in the sense that, again, part of the art of interviewing, it's true of journalism, is nodding, it's smiling. It's what you're doing to me now as we talk to each other. So you're encouraging people, and particularly if they're perhaps a little bit shy or reticent, to open up and be clear. It's clear that this perhaps can be an enjoyable conversation, but you're not in any sense commenting on what people have said. Although, of course, if somebody says, um, say, I know I didn't go to vote, it was pouring with rain, you might just say, oh, yes, it was a pretty rotten day, wasn't it, or something. But it's gained something just to, so it's a conversation. But I mean, a good survey instrument is a structured conversation. So again, the order of the questions in some sense has an order to it that you look as though you're going from one subject to another that makes sense to the person who's answering them. Um, but yes, it is basically you're trying to encourage people by being nice, smiling, etc. Thank you very much, very helpful. But then at the same time, um, not giving any clues about how you feel about what's being
Yeah,
said.
I mean, it would be great to go into all the detail of this statistical analysis that you do. I mean, it strikes me as that. I mean, that's a hell of a job, actually
Oh
drawing.
yeah, oh
Yeah,
absolutely,
I mean,
yeah, yeah.
but we don't have time to do that. But I am interested to look at historical examples of, famously pollsters got it wrong. And one of the examples, of course, which may be before the lifespan of certain people watching this, is the 1992 election, when
Yeah.
surprisingly John Major won the election for the Conservatives rather than Neil Kinnock for Labour.
Yeah,
If we talk purely historically, what did go so very wrong there as far as the polling was concerned?
basically it's sampling, right? In other words, the samples are not particular, well, were not wholly representative. One of the issues was that I may not now entirely remember the right way around, but let's have a go. So basically, in setting their quota for the number of people who should be interviewed living in council houses, which is where most social housing then was, right? Houses being run by local authorities. They were setting it on the basis of the proportion of households that were council accommodation rather than the number of persons living in council houses. And I've forgotten which way around it is. I think the way around it is that people living in council houses were less numerous in the population than they were as a population proportion of households, and so therefore they were oversampling to some degree people living in council houses, and people living in council houses in those days were more likely to vote Labour. So there were some technical issues to do with the sampling. But in general, and then there are debates about whether or not, for example, were interviewers less likely to walk up a long drive to a house than a short drive, and thereby were less likely to get hold of Conservative voters. There was also research done, again, Roger Jarre was quite influential on this, and the kind of the other sampling problem. And again, this has been fairly persistent. It seems to be the case that if you're doing polls within a very short period of time, like 2 or 3 days, which even in those days was the maximum length typically for a face-to-face survey. Tory voters are literally more difficult to find at home than Labour voters. The problem now is that younger people are more likely to vote Labour. Younger people are less likely to vote. But if you therefore overrepresent the proportion of younger people who are going to vote, you end up with a too pro-Labour sample.
Yeah. At the level simply of asking questions, though, is there still room for refinement of question? Well, presumably you argue about this the whole time still, do you?
Yes.
How do you
Yes.
frame a question?
Yeah, there's continued debate about a couple of things. One is whether or not if you say to me, "Oh, I don't know how I'm going to vote," whether or not I should attempt to what we call squeeze you to say, "Oh, look, come on, what do you think you're most likely to vote?" Or whether I'm better going, "Okay, so you're a 65-year-old white male. There's about a 40% chance that you're probably would vote Reform at the moment. So I'll put you down as zero point 0.4 of a Reform voter." So we impute what we think you're going to do on the basis of demographic information. So that's one area. The other area is what to do about turnout. And again, trying to estimate whether people are going to vote or not is proving to be difficult. Again, often it's done, give me a probability from 1 to 10 as your chances of turning up to vote. The alternative, which again has been some attempt done, is to say, okay, I know from the last election, the probability of people with certain circumstances, such as being younger, their probability of voting, I will apply that to my data and weight my data in that way. That, by the way, was quite a lot was done in 2017. As a result of that, the pollsters underestimated Labour's position because they overcorrected. So these are very, very difficult
Who'd
judgments.
be a pollster, Sir John? Who would be a pollster?
Indeed.
But look, let's just finish by talking about politicians themselves. Would you say that politicians take too much notice of pollsters or not enough?
Well, my answer to you, Andrew, is that polls should be taken but not inhaled. Um, so I think you can rely on the polls to give you a broad idea of where we are at and how things are changing. But they won't. I mean, particularly one of the problems is given our first past the post electoral system, you do need remarkable pinpoint accuracy if you're going to get the outcome in terms of seats rights. And now, particularly given our fragmented party system, it's become even more difficult to get these things right. To that extent, at least, there's a limit to, I think, how far we take our skepticism. Beyond that, of course, in part, is up to politicians. I mean, if I say to a politician, look, I've done all this survey research and the evidence is that the public want this rather than this, they can do one of two things. They can change their minds and say, well, maybe that's what we should do. Or they can say, I can try to persuade people to change their minds, right? What you shouldn't do, but I have known politicians do, is to say, I don't believe you. In particular, New Labour, before and after 1997, did not believe the evidence in British social attitudes, that people were more concerned about the state of the health service and about the state of schools than they were about the level of taxation. They had drawn the lesson from the 1992 election, for which we already referred, that they lost because of John Smith's shadow budget, in which it indicated that taxation would go up. And therefore, they were absolutely adamant we had to promise people that we would keep to the Tory spending plans. We wouldn't have to increase taxation. Eventually they discovered through MP surgeries that in fact this was the position, and they did end up putting up taxation. They put up national insurance rather than income tax. So sometimes politicians don't believe you, and sometimes eventually they discover they should have done.
Sir John, it's been such a pleasure speaking to you. I mean, it's a fascinating subject, and we should really be devoting hours to it. But then possibly people wouldn't stay with you. So look, we've had half an hour there of absolutely fascinating insight into the way that you do your job, and I'm sure that people will be able to apply it to their work in oral history interviewing. It's all part of the same thing, really, when it comes down to human interaction and the way that you interact with people to get the answers that you need. But thank you so much, Sir John.
You're
I
welcome.
really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thanks very much indeed.